Trek Profiles Podcast, Episode 4, recorded April 2018. This is the Trek Profiles Podcast, where each episode we sit down with a Star Trek fan. We learn their story, and then we try to figure out why the show means so much to them, to us, and to each of you. I am John, your intrepid host of this whole enterprise, and I welcome you to this, the Trek Profiles Podcast, Episode 4. If you wish to get in touch with us, you can reach us via email at feedback@trekprofiles.com or on Facebook or Twitter at TrekProfiles. Warning! As we record this, we have reached the end of Season 1 of Star Trek Discovery, so all previous Trek content up to and including that point is fair game and may be discussed. You have been warned, human. A key part of the behind-the-scenes work at this podcast belongs to the M5 Multitronic Unit. Are you there, M5?
M5. All systems available at full power.
M5, let's see the subspace communiques.
Messages now displayed on screen 1.
The Trek Profiles Podcast is a proud member of the Tricorder Transmissions Network. We have so many great shows on the network, and I'd love to talk about them all, but for this week, I'd like to highlight our newest show, Weekly Trek. It's a weekly news roundup of all the latest Trek news along with some discussion, and the hosts are a rotating group of all the Tricorder Transmissions hosts, including me, so check it out wherever fine podcasts are sold. If you enjoy this or any of the other shows on the network and you wish to support us, you may do so through Patreon, where support gets you quicker access to unedited episodes and some other benefits, another couple of which we will be announcing very shortly. Another way you can support this or any of our shows is if you visit our show pages in iTunes and rate and review us while you're there. It helps us out so much and helps other Trek fans just like you find our shows. People are starting to send us feedback, which is fantastic. Matt from Berkeley, California emails in and says he's enjoying the show, but he wants to hear more from the M5. In response, I can only say that the M5 is fairly shy and he just doesn't want to talk too much. And Maria from Jacksonville, Florida asks why the show isn't weekly. The answer for that, Maria, is actually very simple. There are two reasons. One, I travel for my work, so it'd be very difficult for me to commit to a weekly show. Second, I do a ton of prep for each episode, and there's just one of me, so I don't want to get overloaded. I've tried to make sure that there is an episode at least monthly, and I view that monthly commitment as a floor, not a ceiling, so I do try to get them out more often than that. Thank you for all of your feedback, ladies and gents. I really do appreciate it. All right, let's see what you fine people thought of the Kobayashi Maru questions from Episode 2. Let's see what we got. Question 1. Which was the better film, Star Trek V or Star Trek Nemesis? Our guest Haley said Star Trek V, and 58% of you agreed with her. Question 2. You've won an all-expense-paid vacation to one of these two planets. Which one do you pick, Ferenginar or Nimbus 3? Haley said Ferenginar, and 67% of you agreed. I guess you are all rainy day people. Question 3. Would you rather visit the USS Discovery or the USS Shenzhou? Haley said Discovery, and 72% of you agreed. Most of it seemed to revolve around the fandom's either crush or admiration for Sylvia Tilly. Question 4. Worst pet idea ever, Klingon Targ or Cardassian Vole? Haley picked Targ, but 62% of you thought the Vole would be worse. Question 5. Time for breakfast. Will it be egg white burritos with fire-roasted salsa or a green shake, extra green? Haley picked the green shake, but 69% of you picked the egg white burritos. I didn't know y'all were on the Burnham diet plan. All right, that's it for messages and communiques. Let's move on. M5, run the intelligence profile for this week's guest, and let's start the show.
Working.
His favorite non-human race is the Romulans. What the what? His favorite ship is the 1701 refit from The Motion Picture. He nominates both Mr. Spock and Commander Sisko to be his favorite characters. You can find him on the Twitter at TrekGeeks and on the Facebook at facebook.com/TrekGeeks. He is from that most granite of the states, New Hampshire, North America, Earth, and Sector 001. It's Bill Smith. Welcome, Bill, and thank you for being on my podcast.
Oh, the pleasure is absolutely mine. Greetings from the ninth state today, and I'm very much looking forward to this.
Thank you, Bill. I got to say, I'm really excited that we're at 50% Trek Geek power today to have one half of that institution that is the Trek Geeks on the show. I'm super excited, but I have to ask you my first question, which is the same question I always ask. Bill, are you a Star Trek fan?
Yes. I call it whatever you want. You could call it Star Trek fan. You could call it Trekkie. You could call it Trek geek, as I am often want to do. But without hesitation, I am absolutely a Star Trek fan.
I find it really strange that there's all these that there was this whole kerfuffle between Trekkie and Trekker. And Trek fan and all these other terms. I was talking to someone on Twitter about this just the other day. Do you seem to be a agnostic in that whole discussion?
Well, typically, if I'm asked, I'll self-identify as a Trekkie because that's how I grew up. I mean, there was a period in our lives, because you and I aren't that far off in age, where Trekkie was a pejorative. People used it as a term of derision and, to put people down who love Star Trek. And that's really kind of where Trekker came from. I love this whole revisionist history that, well, Trekker was for TNG, and that's only partially true because people thought Trekkie was an insult. So I'm proud to be a Trekkie. I wear it on my sleeve every single day of my life. And, but I mean, people's fandom is unique to their own lives and their own hearts. So, I mean, if somebody calls themselves a Trekker, I think it's fantastic.
I usually kept it pretty much on the down low, especially in corporate life, in my normal corporate drone sort of work. And one year at the Star Trek convention, a local reporter took my picture in a full-on cosplay and put it in the local paper. So that all went right out the window after that. So
you were outed big time. That's awesome.
Oh yeah. In fact, people were coming up to my mom, who lives also here in town, and were saying, "Is this your son?" in the newspaper. So yeah, my cover was blown big time, but that's all right. I own it.
Well, and we do, right? I mean, as Star Trek fans, it's something that's personal to us, so we own it however we choose. And if that's, to keep it, pretty much in our private lives away from work, then that's just as amazing as putting yourself out there each and every day with something Star Trek on.
Yeah. And, I got to say, I mean, just personally speaking, that's one of the reasons I wanted to do the podcast, is because while I have a lot of great people around me and all that I share my life with, there's not a lot of people around me who are as into Trek as I am in my day-to-day life. So this is sort of my outlet here. And that's why I'm jazzed to do the podcast and to talk to amazing Trek fans such as yourself.
Well, and I love the POV that your podcast has, because every one of us has a different entry point into the franchise, and it means something different to everybody. Even if it seems similar, it touches us all in markedly different ways. And I think that's the fascinating part of it all.
So what was your entry point into the franchise? Or asked another way, what's your first Star Trek memory?
Well, I have to say, I grew up I was a single-digit child in the 70s. So, I mean, I was born in 1969, and my earliest Star Trek memory is in my parents' living room in Manchester, New Hampshire, with my older brother, John. And actually, truth be told, my half-brother, but, my parents really weren't big on the whole, half designation. We were either brothers and sisters or we weren't. So we were. And every night at 6 p.m., he would want to watch Star Trek, and I would want to watch The $6 Million Man. And it became a battle of the ages every single night. And the very first time it happened, the Corbomite maneuver was on. And I mean, I fought like you wouldn't believe, because I wanted to watch Colonel Steve Austin. I mean, what child wouldn't, quite frankly? And I lost because he was my older brother. And I sat there and I watched it and I was riveted. But there was no way in hell I was going to let my brother know that, because he won. And this was the dance that we engaged in for years, but it all started with that one episode. And it is my earliest Star Trek memory, was that fight, that battle of the century in my parents' living room.
I think it's actually interesting the way that you phrase that that story, Bill, because I'm comparing the story you just told me, and that certainly mirrors my own experience, to the experience that people would have today in coming into Star Trek fandom. In that, when we were kids, you had to have appointment viewing. You had to sit down at a certain point at a certain time, and an episode was selected for you to watch. And whatever it was, that's what you got. And now you have all the Trek all the time, and all 700 and something hours are available anytime you want, anywhere you want. I wonder if that changes not just how people are consuming Star Trek, but sort of their appreciation of it, because they can be more selective in how they consume it.
Well, I think it absolutely does. And I think the other thing it does is that it makes it more of a solitary experience. So, in the 1970s, 42 years ago, probably, if I'm, putting a thumbnail on it, my brother and I had to interact. And this fight over Star Trek, caused us to become closer, because ultimately it turned into us watching Star Trek together. And it was something that we shared, to the point where in 1979, he took me to the matinee of Star Trek: The Motion Picture when it premiered in theaters that December. And granted, we both fell asleep during the movie because, I was 10 years old.
What?
Yeah. Well, there wasn't a whole lot of, there for a 10-year-old, but now in hindsight, it's probably one of, if not my favorite Star Trek film, because of how Star Trek it is. But it was that journey through Star Trek that my brother and I took every single night at 6:00 that ultimately meant the world to me. And I don't think that probably happens as much today, if I can just dial it up on my phone and watch it, in the corner with earbuds in, as somebody watches something else.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been doing a rewatch, and some of these episodes, especially in the later series, I feel like I have a harder time relating to some of them. So I feel like I want to skip them or fast forward a little bit if the episode's not so great. But for TOS, just like you, I watched every single episode multiple times because it's what was on, and I had no ability to skip it, unless I just didn't want to watch. And, that wasn't going to happen. So I have all the TOS episodes like burned into my head in a way that I don't think the other series ever will get to, just because of the realities of how television was when I was a kid.
Well, and you think about it, when Star Trek was in syndication in the 70s, you pretty much had a chance to watch, an episode again 3 months from now, because they would repeat that often because there was only 79 episodes. So, if you're watching it every night at 6, odds are 3 months from now, you're going to see the Corbin White maneuver again.
Oh, absolutely. And actually, going along with that is one of the things I also think about is the way that people are watching it nowadays. They're usually watching those remastered TOS episodes, and there's subtle changes. Do you feel that those subtle changes affect how people would accept or view those episodes in any way?
Perhaps. I find that I'd like to default to the remastered ones these days, simply because I really enjoy the work that was put into them to make them look a little more realistic for today. If I'm watching, Who Mourns for Adonais, and I see the green hand come in, it doesn't look as good with the 1960s visual effects as it does with the remastered version. I'm not going to lie. Or something like the Doomsday Machine, where it almost takes on the scope of a film with the way those external sequences go now. I think it makes the episode even more compelling and even more tense, to be honest. So I find that I default to those, and it definitely has changed how I perceive those original episodes that I grew up with.
Gotcha. I have to ask you about your selection of the Romulans as one of your more interesting races. I agree with you that I think they're pretty interesting, but I always felt like they just loved deceit and guile a little too much for my taste. So explain your choice.
Well, and that's certainly one of the leading reasons why. With the Romulans, they're essentially the emotional Vulcans. They give us some kind of insight as to what the Vulcan society may have been. And certainly, we all have an affection for the Vulcans, but the Romulans show up when you least expect them. And then they show up, and then it's always uncertain, whether it's in the original series or whether it's Next Gen, where they say they're going to do things and they never really do things. Or in TOS, when you have something like Balance of Terror, which really was sort of, our first exposure to the Romulans, and certainly mine as a child. Here's this enemy, and I use very loose quotes around that because they really don't seem all that bad in Balance of Terror, even though they've been blowing up Federation colonies. But they're people you can relate to in that moment, especially the Romulan commander. And I found them fascinating. I found them to be a great foil to whomever our captain was. At first, it was Kirk, and then obviously it was Picard after that. But they were never quick to haul out a disruptor or a bladed weapon like a Klingon. They weren't about necessarily greed and profit like the Ferengis. They weren't like any one of the normal aliens of the week who presented violence at first. They always presented something cerebral, something you had to think through. And I think that was really what my attraction to them was.
That certainly seems to be the common DNA between the Romulans and the Vulcans for sure.
Absolutely. And and like you said, there's that guile and deceit. I mean, they may turn on you in a heartbeat. There's a political structure, to Romulans, even on their ships. And as somebody who, grew up in a state that is very heavily focused on as far as politics goes every 4 years, I suppose that there was that natural attraction too.
Did you ever read the books that were the Romulan origin story?
I didn't. I had a love affair with books early on in my preteens and my teens. And then as I recently explained to Dayton Ward, just prolific Star Trek author, you read books for a while and then, you get to be a teenager and your teenage life starts to happen. And then, your post high school life starts to happen. And then you get a job and work creeps in. And then maybe you get married and life creeps in. And then you find yourself with less and less time to read. It's only recently that I've actually come around to reading again at almost 50 years old. So I've got a lot to catch up on.
Gotcha. By the way, for all the listeners, if you haven't, you definitely should listen to that interview on Discovering Trek with Dayton Ward. And another shout out too. I've been slowly working my way through your oeuvre, your recorded episodes. Yeah, I'm going to drop some, vocabulary word bombs on you today. And I especially enjoyed your Star Trek motion picture episode on Trek Geeks. I thought it was just fantastic and a really good analysis of the movie. So I enjoyed it incredibly, and I'd recommend it to everybody.
Oh, thank you very much. That's awfully kind of you.
No, yeah, it's also true. Favorite ship. Now, Bill, you selected for your favorite ship the Enterprise refit. Tell us about that.
So growing up and watching Star Trek on television, I mean, there's a fondness we all have for the original Enterprise and Matt Jeffries' design. When we got to Star Trek: The Motion Picture, and they revealed that Enterprise, I mean, it was something breathtaking to behold. It didn't look the same, but I tell you what, it looks gorgeous from every single angle. In fact, it is more angular, and I think that's part of the reason why I love it. So it's got character. Not that the cylindrical warp nacelles of the original 1701 don't, but there's just something about the refit that it looks right to me. It looks like it was made for film, and truth be told, it was. But it's lit spectacularly. The contrast between it and the space backdrop behind it is beautiful. And as much as people complain about that scene where nothing happens when Scotty and Kirk fly all over that Enterprise to take the tour, that sort of starship porn moment, as I like to refer to it, it's breathtaking, and I watch every single second of it every single time because it just makes my heart melt. I think it's that beautiful.
My defense here of the starship porn moment in that episode is really that it's very emblematic of filmmaking in the 70s, which was at a far more leisurely pace than what we do nowadays, for sure.
Oh, by far. These days it would be, maybe a 10 or 15 second, beauty shot, almost like in Star Trek 2009 when McCoy and Kirk are headed to the Enterprise on that shuttle. And that's it. There's no glorious flyby. You get one sort of, elegant pan out from the shuttlecraft window, and that's about it. They took the time to introduce the Enterprise to you in Star Trek: The Motion Picture, and I think that's why it's always resonated with me so well.
Do you have models of it around you, or do you collect any of the little ships? And
I'm looking at least 3 of them right now.
All refit?
There's one original, there's one refit, and there's one 2009.
I can tell you that I think I probably made the Enterprise refit model kit at least 10 times growing up.
Yeah, and in fact, when Star Trek 3 happened, I was heartbroken. To see that ship just blown up like that. I was so heartbroken that I took one of the the Enterprise refit models, and I stuck firecrackers in the saucer, or in the secondary hull, I mean, and then I lit them up and I let that thing just blow apart, just to excise my mourning and my guilt.
Well, the part of that I will never forgive, and someday I want to go find the person who did this and shake my fist at them angrily, was the person who put the self-destruction of the Enterprise in the commercials for the movie.
Oh, I know.
I mean, talk about a spoiler, man. It was in the commercial. It was in the ads. And this was in the days before streaming and fast forward.
So this is absolutely factual. I cried when the Enterprise was destroyed. I did not cry when Spock died. I mean, this shows you how much I love that Enterprise. I love Spock, don't get me wrong, but the Enterprise, as I'm sure we'll get to later, was my boyhood ship of dreams. And to watch it just go out like that it was heartbreaking for me.
I'd agree with you. And I think one of the things that I think is hard for other incarnations of Trek to match is that there was this feeling that, but we had so much time with that particular ship, right? I mean, we're talking from 1966 until 1980. I guess, is when Star Trek 3 came out, if memory serves, of seeing that ship and experiencing those characters on that ship. And it just had so much time to sit with us that it's very hard to match that in a motion picture or in a series that you might watch on online or any modern incarnation. I think it's just that the time that it had to sit with us just made it so much more powerful. And I agree with you that I think one of the things that was so powerful about that moment in Star Trek 3 is that the ship is the embodiment of the whole Enterprise. Mad pun bomb. It's the whole Enterprise is the ship, and one of the characters, even the most beloved of characters, which Spock arguably is. It's another thing entirely to take it to the representation of all of Star Trek at that point, which is the ship, and destroy that.
Well, it was a second heartbreaking loss after a huge loss in the movie before. The Enterprise at that point was part of pop culture all over the world. Everybody knew who Captain Kirk was and Mr. Spock, but they also knew the Enterprise just by looking at it. So to see it, burn up in the atmosphere of essentially the Genesis planet after, the saucer just blown apart, which, oh my God, that still kills me to this day, was like insult after injury,
Yeah, and then it comes immediately after David Marcus being killed too, which is
yes.
Another sucker punch that I certainly didn't expect.
And some of Shatner's best acting in Star Trek in that scene where he is leveled, literally.
Yeah, one thing I never found out, I wonder if someone knows the answer to this, but I remembered listening to one of the commentary tracks, and I want to say it was Nick Meyer on Star Trek 2, and he said that the best way to get a good performance out of Shatner is to keep having him redo the scenes until he kind of gets bored with it, and that's when he acts his best.
Yes.
And I wonder how many takes they had on that scene, if at all, but I agree with you. It certainly was stunning. So you collect, you have some of the Enterprise models around you. What else do you collect?
Well, I think my collection tastes have changed. As a kid, I would, collect anything that had Star Trek on it. And I grew up pretty poor, so I didn't have very many things. We get to jump forward to the 90s, and I'm, in my early 20s when, sort of Next Gen is in its heyday and Deep Space Nine is introduced. I started collecting the Playmates action figures and toys that they had. And in my storage unit, I've still got an entire array of them still mint on the card. I told myself at some point, back then they might be my retirement, but I think we all know now that that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
For one reason or another, the value is not that high of those things. So every now and then I get the idea, maybe I'm just going to open them. But these days I collect, photographs and memories and the occasional autograph. Because those have become infinitely more important to me. Like I've been, I have a photo of myself from 5 years ago with the cast of Deep Space Nine. At the Star Trek Las Vegas convention, one of those photo ops. And it's missing Alexander Siddig and Cole Meany, but it's got mostly everybody else, including Avery Brooks. And slowly I've been collecting signatures on that because I want to frame it and put it in my office. I'm standing right there next to Terry Farrell, and I'm just absolutely beaming and overjoyed because I love Deep Space Nine so much. And those are the types of things I collect now, and I'm very selective about which ones of those things I do, simply because, well, we've only got so much wall space, right?
So why is it important to you to collect the autographs and to finish that? Why do you want that on your wall? Why?
Because it means something to me. I think that as a fan, it's allowed me to touch part of the creator, if you will. I get to be a little V'ger-ish.
Nice.
Yeah, thank you. I just pulled that one out. I've had enough coffee. It's the memory. It's like, yeah, I remember that moment vividly now. I remember, even though it lasted, an incredibly short amount of time, I remember Terry Farrell, waving me over. And I remember that, her comm badge pin is upside down on her dress, because it had gone askew. And, I remember that everybody was just so gracious and fantastic. And, they were laughing right before I got there. But it's the memory of that really carries me forward. The picture is fantastic. The autographs are wonderful. But that moment as a fan, to be there with the people whose work I've admired for so long, is really what means the most.
See, we're having our Data and Picard moment in First Contact, where I'm asking, why did you feel the need to touch the missile?
I may need to be alone.
Oh dear, that was a double entendre, which was unintentional.
You're welcome.
That's 10 out of 10, man. That's going to make a best of reel someday. So you're collecting the autographs and those things, right? Because the memories are important to you. Do you find that you often look back at those things? Do you often show them off to other people? Are they a conversation item for you? Do you keep them at home or at work? How do you display them?
I keep them at home. Right now, like my Deep Space Nine one is still rolled up in a tube because there's still two signatures I'm missing. One of them is Michael Dorn, and the running joke is that every time I go to his table in Vegas, he's never there. People like Haley Stoddard, who was on a previous episode of this fine podcast, and other Star Trek friends like Robert Reyes, who will always feel free to let me know when Michael is at his table and I'm off doing something somewhere else that I just can't leave. It's just that I've never synced up. That guy is the one guy in Vegas who's never at his table, is the running joke. And then Avery Brooks is the only other signature I don't have. And I regretfully, I think it's the one I'm probably not going to be able to get because I'm not sure he's going to do any more conventions. Yeah,
he seems to be pretty well done with Star Trek for some reason.
Yeah, and that's, I understand. He's a very ethereal guy, if I had to tag an adjective on it. And I'm sure he goes through phases like this. He was there 5 years ago. I understand. Maybe for him, that was his closure on Star Trek. I don't know. But there are various things that I keep it. There's at work, I have a scan of my picture with William Shatner that I also got autographed, which is an entire story all on its own. And that's really the only one I keep at work. And it's a scan of that because the original is locked away in a fire safe.
Nice. Nice.
That seems obsessive, I know, but at the time that was the very first one that I got, and it was kind of the holy grail at the time because it's Captain Kirk. Captain Kirk was everything to me as a kid.
I'm trying to think back, though. I want to stay with Avery Brooks for a second. Was that the Star Trek Las Vegas convention where they had all the captains on stage at once?
Oh, that I think it may have been. To be honest, I don't remember exactly, but it's definitely the most likely. It was certainly the one where Avery just broke spontaneously into song during his convention appearance that year, and it was beautiful.
If I'm remembering right, is that the one where Sirach just suddenly jumped up on stage in the middle of Avery Brooks's panel?
I think so. Yes.
I think I was there. Okay, because that's what I'm trying to figure out. I'm searching my memory banks, man, and it's really hard. I haven't had my third espresso shot this morning.
Well, if it wasn't that one, it was the one that was either a year or two before. But I do have Avery Brooks' autograph from one of the conventions at the Hilton when they were there in Vegas. The last one where the experience was around. So, I do have that. I just wish that I had it now in that group photo because it's a fantastic shot.
So you go to a lot of the conventions or some number of conventions. Why do you go?
Well, at first, I used to go to see Star Trek people. Now I go for my Star Trek family, for the friends that I've made in and gotten close to over the years, because really it's the one time a year we all get together and share this thing that binds us. I've seen the panels, I'm sure as many have, and there's only so many different times you can hear the question, in this episode, ... And that's all great. I mean, there are Trekkies who still want that as their experience, and fantastic. I'm glad that these conventions continue to succeed as a result. But I go for the camaraderie and, the sense of family and the fun. I spend more time hanging out with my friends than I do actually at panels these days. And I'm absolutely fine with that, because that's the experience I want at this point.
So it's the gathering of the tribe.
Absolutely, it is. Our friends various friends at Tricorder, present company included. A bunch of my buddies and I convene in the desert every year that same weekend, and we have some great meals, and we do a little golf, and we do some Star Trek, and it's become an annual event for me on a variety of levels. And I'll be there every year that I'm able.
It's really funny that you mentioned that, because it's not a secret that I live here in Las Vegas. And when originally I started going to the conventions, I would go home every night. And I would go to the panels, and because that's what I thought it was, and I would go to the panels, I would experience that, and it was great, and I enjoyed it. And it wasn't till I actually started staying at the hotel that I realized that the convention isn't the panels. It's I discovered that I'm agreeing with you. It really was the tribe gathering, and it was a whole different experience once I started actually staying up there.
Well, at the root of convention is the word convene, right? And we convene with all of these amazing fellow fans from all over the world, at once a year. And some of those memories and discussions and laughs that we have, when the panels are over and we're just sort of, all in our own time at various places, whether it's a bar or a restaurant or even, some people in their rooms watching Star Trek, are some of the best memories I have the last decade. They really are.
Who's your favorite character? All seasons, all shows, all movies.
Do I have to pick one?
I will encourage you to see if you can pick one, but if you want to pick several, you're welcome to do that.
It's hard because, on any given day, it's okay. Today, right now, this point in time, as we record this for time and all eternity, I'm going to say Benjamin Sisko.
Tell me why.
Benjamin Sisko is an imperfect man who is in command of a station and later a starship. He was different than the two captains we saw previously, who were all sort of, paragons of Starfleet. Yes, they made decisions that were, perhaps questionable or bad at times, but at the end of the day, they always wore the white hat. And while Sisko absolutely does, he's a passionate man who makes mistakes, who has set before him a challenge of trying to navigate being a religious icon on top of being a Starfleet officer, on top of being a father. And, his relationship with his son, is something he wears on his sleeve. It's the purest love in all of Star Trek. It's the only non-dysfunctional family relationship in the whole of Star Trek. And I think that that's what makes Benjamin Sisko probably my favorite character, that with everything going on, he still has this relationship with Jake, and it's beautiful. It's a level of depth that I don't think the other captains got, and it's something I think they did very well with Sisko.
So then, by implication, you were calling the Crusher's relationship dysfunctional.
To some extent, because Beverly leaves, right? She leaves, and she leaves, the officers of the 1701D to raise her son. And then she comes back, and she and Wesley aren't exactly on the best of terms for a little bit. And then they never really interact as mother and son after that. So I think that there's a large amount of dysfunction there. And then Wesley leaves. He's like, I'm out of here. So while as it started off that way, I think the writers probably really missed an opportunity and blew it later on when Wesley was on the ship being raised by the community of officers. So I think that Sisko edges out the Crushers significantly in that regard.
Then what do you think about the Worf and Alexander relationship?
Worf is the worst father ever. Worf doesn't want to be a dad. He's thrust into being his dad because his parents say, look, buddy, he's your kid, not ours. step up here and do something. And then he spends, the rest of the time not understanding what Alexander is about. Alexander's a sensitive kid, right? I mean, he's got some human DNA in there to some extent. And he all he wants Alexander to do is to be a warrior. And Alexander's not a warrior. Alexander might have been a good scientist, but Worf is the detached father who really only is a father because he has to be. He takes the responsibility seriously later on, but Alexander's an annoyance early on. Especially as Worf is getting used to that role, and I don't feel Worf is ever used to that role because as soon as he gets to Deep Space Nine, there's no Alexander.
So you feel that he never came to terms with it and never turns it around and just sort of maintained a low-level awfulness as a dad?
I do. Worf is such a great character in so many other ways, but I really think that the ball was dropped as far as his being a father.
I think one of the things I think about as I analyze Worf is that he just wants to be more Klingon than the Klingons. And he sacrificed a lot, including his relationship with his kid, to sort of meet this standard, which even the Klingons themselves didn't really seem to strive for.
Yeah, and I think they didn't strive for it because it was largely unattainable. And I don't think that Worf ever truly comes to that realization until much, much later. When Worf is sort of finally comfortable in his own skin. And I think the irony is he doesn't find that till Deep Space Nine. So, Worf, not exactly a great dad. Alexander, all he wanted was somebody to love him like any kid does, right? And he lost that when K'Ehleyr was killed. And then he kind of jumped around, whether it was to the Rozhenkos or to Worf or off to, the Martok family at some point. I think he suffered from it as a result.
And let's not forget the adopted son that Worf took in that one episode that we never heard from again either.
Yes, Jeremy Astor.
Oh,
that's
poor
right.
Kid.
In the bonding. Yeah. You will be a part of my family. Crickets.
Well, you got to love just the realities of television production in the 90s, right? And that's just how it was. Yeah. Bill, I want to ask you how you consume your Trek these days. Are you a disciplined rewatcher, or do you just pop in whatever episode strikes your fancy at the moment? Or do you watch Star Trek on some sort of schedule? Tell me about how you consume it.
These days, it's very haphazard to some extent. I will do dedicated rewatches, if I feel there's a purpose. Like right now, I'm rewatching Deep Space Nine because it's the 25th anniversary year. Last year I watched Next Gen because it was the 30th anniversary year. But other than that, I will watch episodes perhaps as they come up as topics of conversation on Trek Geeks, or just because I get the inkling to watch an episode. And usually it's on a Saturday, probably more often than not, and largely because it's usually while my wife is out doing other things, because although she appreciates Star Trek, she's not the fan that I am, and I respect that. So I don't necessarily want to tie our TV up 24/7 with nothing but Star Trek, because I have a feeling that would grow old pretty quick for her.
So you're watching it then on a big screen, or so you're not watching on a portable device?
No, I like to watch it, on a regular TV screen. Portable devices have their place. I mean, I'll watch it on a plane that way, but I mean, I like to watch it in my living room on my television because that's how I grew up watching it. It feels right to watch it that way.
Gotcha. I've had a different experience myself in that, of course, just like you, I grew up watching it on WPIX in New York every night at, I think it was 5 or 6 o'clock, and I would sit there cross-legged on the carpet and watch it on the TV. And I ain't sitting cross-legged on the carpet no mo.
No, I'm sitting on the sofa with my glasses on because I have to at this point.
But you know what I find is that when I watch it on the small screen on a tablet or on a phone or something like that, is that my attention is drawn to other parts of the screen that I think I miss if I watch it on the TV for some reason. And I just find it's given me a different appreciation. I don't know if anyone else has had that experience, but for me, it's changed some of my appreciation of the show. Not in a bad way at all, but it's certainly a different experience in some way.
I can agree with that. I mean, there was one time I had to go to Las Vegas for work earlier this year, and which of course is because we had dinner one night. And I watched that week's episode of Star Trek Discovery on my iPad, and it wasn't the same. It was good, don't get me wrong, but watching it on the small screen felt more contained to me, and I wanted to see it, in a much more glorious fashion. So I rewatched it again immediately when I got home on my 60-inch television.
Nice. Nice. That was a great dinner, by the way. I really enjoyed that. So thank you for allowing me to entertain you.
Oh, it was a great night, and with some great food and great company. And next time we're out in Vegas, we'll have to do it again.
All right. I'm totally on board with that. So, Bill, we've been talking about episodes. We were talking about how we consume Star Trek. So let me ask you, I've had the M5 do some gentle internet sleuthing, and it came up with a list that it proposed to me of episodes that are meaningful for you. So what I'd like to do is use some of these as provocations to get the conversation going as we do some analysis here. It actually was able to select for me an episode from each of the major series. So let me ask you, I guess we'll go in chronological order. And you started with the Corbomite maneuver as when I asked you about how you learned about Star Trek and what your first experience was. You actually remembered that it was that episode. So tell me why that episode was meaningful to you, if in any other way than it was the first one that you remember.
Well, certainly, I mean, that reason ranks right up there. But even as a child, I understood from this episode that there was something different about humanity. What is it that Mission Log likes to say? This is the episode that says, this is, who we say we are, when they get to the end of it and they decide to help Baylock.
The mighty Ken Ray says, risk is our business.
That's right. Risk is our business. And in this, I mean, they set aside the fact that there was a threat that almost destroyed the Enterprise. And at the end, they reach out to this life form. And I use life form in place of this ugly baby. And
hey, man, don't be busting on poor Mr. Howard there.
Well, come on. I mean, and McCoy and Bailey. But first, the Tranya.
It's why I always feel like I have to drink grapefruit juice while watching the episode.
And then I always feel compelled to do this.
I'm so glad you did that, because I'm going to excerpt that clip, and that's going to be my ringtone from now on.
I love it. But at the end of that episode, there's the realization that even though there was this threat and this mannequin that was used to intimidate, at the end of the day, this person, this species, is not really all that different from us, and what they crave is knowledge. And so let's set aside the fact that there was a threat, and let's learn more. Let's find out about this entity. And Bailey certainly has that biggest turnaround in that episode, because he's like, yeah, me, sir, I'd like to stay. It starts a path for me of looking at things, even as a child, a little more critically, and understanding that there may be something deeper than what's presented initially.
I thought that was one of the most poignant and moving parts of the whole episode, is Bailey staying behind, because we don't know he didn't know in the moment as the character what was happening, or what his disposition was going to be. Am I going to go back to the Enterprise at some point? What's my life going to be? Whatever plans he had for his life might have just evaporated. I mean, he made an incredible life decision in the snap of his fingers. It was amazing to me.
Well, and Bailey in that episode is probably the character that is the most scared and the most fearful. He's the viewer at some point, right? Because, we're, as the viewer, we're not certain what's going on. We're sensing the tension and the fear. And then at the end, he turns around and says, you know what? I'm going to go with this person. And it's a lesson that's very obvious, even to, the 6-7-year-old child that I was at the time. So it's an episode that really taught me what Star Trek was about the first time out of the gate. And I've always felt, lucky that I got that lesson, on day one.
And, Bill, it actually is interesting that, in my opinion, this is another episode that really got a step up in the remaster, because the Fesarius just looks so much more impressive in the remastered episodes. If you go back and compare the two, it really just is night and day.
Absolutely. It adds a larger degree of realism. I mean, don't get me wrong. Seeing the version from the 60s as a child was pretty awe-inspiring. I mean, you look at that and you go, whoa. And then when I saw it again for the first time as the remastered version, I thought it even drove it home even more to the point where it gave me a little goosebumps. So I think the remastered version really elevates this episode significantly on top of what it was before, which was already pretty amazing.
See, that's one of the things I think we touched on earlier, and I think I want to revisit it for a second, which is being of similar age as you and I, when we grew up and we watched these episodes as they were in syndication in the 70s and 80s. Do you think that it somehow affects the fans who came later, that being raised and or coming to, just being a media consumer in 21st century Earth, that our expectations of what TV should look like and how characters should act, that it sort of limits the appeal of TOS in some way, because it'll never quite match those modern sensibilities in a lot of ways, and like they'll never connect to those TOS episodes perhaps the same way you and I do?
Maybe. It's hard to say because, like everybody's fandom, it's unique to the individual, right? To take the Star Wars remastered for a minute, I can't watch those. To me, they're far too distracting because I think that they tried to do too much with them. If you look at the Star Trek remastered, they stay fairly true to the originals. I mean, they tried not to muck with it too much. I mean, there are some episodes where it definitely adds significant value, but at its core, really what they did was just improve the flybys and some of the externals. So I think that I don't know that it takes that much away from the originals. I think enhanced is the right word, but I know that as a result of the 2009 movies, a lot of people have gone back to discover the originals, and depending on where they watched them, it could very well have been just the remasters, and I think that's okay on some level. Maybe it'll convince them to watch the original as they were presented in the 60s, but if that winds up being the end result, I don't know that that's the worst thing.
Gotcha. And one little trivia note for all the tens of listeners of this is that the Corbomite maneuver was actually the episode where Leonard Nimoy says he actually discovered what Spock was and figured out how the character should be. And it was all based on, I think it was the director who gave him some notes, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's great that we have all this perspective and hindsight to look back on now. Thanks, internet.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's move on to TNG. So it seems like in TNG, we have a toss-up between the Drumhead and Family, two very, very different episodes in tone and content. So which one do you want to start with?
Let's take the latter first. Let's go with Family. I think it is probably one of the most surprising episodes of Next Gen. Mainly because it's more of an exploration of ourselves directly rather than it is through the lens of science fiction. I mean, Star Trek has always been a mirror for ourselves, but Family is a direct examination of relationships, and they're uncomfortable. I mean, you get to see Jean-Luc Picard broken. We've never seen a starship captain like that. I mean, he's rolling around in the mud in the vineyard sobbing. And that was a very stark moment for me as a fan. There I was, my early 20s going, wow. It was staggering. And he has a fairly defined internal conflict going on. Does he go back to the Enterprise, or does he go below the sea and explore there? So I think that it was a definite change up, and it's one of the episodes I appreciate the most because I thought it was the perfect follow-up to the Best of Both Worlds. In an episodic television series, more often than not, characters develop amnesia. They may have something happen to them. They may get tortured one week and the next week, everything's fine. But Family was one of those rare instances in Star Trek where everything was not fine. And we got to see that firsthand. And I thought that it was incredibly refreshing.
Because that episode exists as the not explicit third part of Best of Both Worlds, is that it enhances Best of Both Worlds because we deal with the consequences in a subsequent episode.
Yes.
And I contrast that in my own head with City on the Edge of Forever from original series, which is a very powerful episode, certainly arguably one of the best episodes of Star Trek ever, some people would argue, and I think there's a case to be made there. But because there's no follow-on from it, because we don't see Kirk struggling with the aftermath of it, I feel in some way it lessens the episode, and I feel that that's what makes Family so good.
That you've summed it up perfectly. We get to see Picard, deal with the long-reaching effects of having his humanity eviscerated completely. Kirk falls in love in the scope of 48 minutes, and then loses that love. And okay, it's a bit tropey. I get it. It's hard to tell a love story in an episodic format. I understand, but Picard has had every ounce of his humanity taken from him. And now that it's kind of been put back together all Humpty Dumpty like, he has to deal with that aftermath. And he goes to the one place in this galaxy where he feels he can do that. And it's to his older brother. And I think that episode just, like you said, it probably, for me, stands above The City on the Edge of Forever for that reason, because we get to see the after effects. And I think that's crucial to Jean-Luc Picard.
I agree with you that family is a very powerful episode, and it really is a classic story, right? Guy comes back from war, struggles to reconnect with his family, right? And we take away all the science fiction elements, and we let these actors, who are all amazing, just shine, and they get to do their lines and act their scenes in a way that they don't have to necessarily struggle with any technobabble or any other weirdness. They just get to relate. It's really fantastic. How do you feel that the story of what eventually happens to Robert and Renee, does that change your interpretation of this episode or affect it in any way?
It doesn't change my interpretation of the episode, but it does cause me to want to excise Star Trek Generations from canon on any one of a number of given days, because I thought it was just such a horrible way to present a challenge for Picard than to just kill these characters off screen. They died in a fire. Oh, come on. That's just so lame. I thought it cheapened what they meant to Picard with the way they dealt with it. And I thought that it was a bit of an insult to the viewer to some extent. So, Picard was in the process of restoring that relationship and getting to know his nephew. And to have that happen really kind of angered me. I'm glad that I still have family to see that relationship resolve itself, but I'll never, be happy with Generations as a result of that.
See, and I think there's something that I'm trying to get at here, which is that, especially with our modern sensibilities and with the advent of streaming and how people are binging shows, I think it's affecting how people are consuming it and thinking about Star Trek, especially in this context, because we take it as a whole. We take it as one complete story, even though it was never meant to be consumed that way. And I think this also comes up in something you just mentioned, which is this theory of Star Trek canon, which, this might be a controversial position, and I'll let you respond to it, but I don't think canon exists. I think it's a word we use that is nonsensical and has no bearing on Star Trek, because it was never a show that presented itself as one that had a coherent, predefined universe and characters that were a certain way and was internally consistent. It never promised that to us. So it seems to me that we're trying to impose that today, especially with the way that we consume shows and streaming, and that we demand a consistency and an integration of the stories, even when it's not inherent in the show itself.
I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to take the hit on this. And anybody who wants to send me hate mail for this is welcome to. You can hit me on Twitter, or you can email me through the Trek Geek site. I'm going to make this statement right here, right now. I hate canon. I think canon is a construct that has been applied by fans, and it creates unnecessary constraints on creative people who are just trying to create Star Trek. I mean, if I look at franchises like Superman, Batman, that have been around for over half a century, and they can tell and retell their origin story any one of a number of times, and it's okay. Or a character like James Bond that can go through multiple iterations and people are still okay with the fact that it's James Bond. Why can't Star Trek? It seems to be the one franchise that is not allowed to evolve or change in any way because the fans will throw a fit. I think of canon as, an albatross to some extent. Star Trek's a canvas. Right?
It's a development platform.
Yeah, exactly. I want good stories that are told well. I mean, if I consider some of the novels, which have told some of the most amazing Star Trek stories, themselves, or some of the comics, which tell stories that are better than some of the movies. The fact that some people go, well, I reject those because those aren't canon. I think it's absolutely absurd. It's all Star Trek. It tells stories that, that are in line with Gene's vision, or that tell stories that mean something to the reader or the watcher, or that inspire us on some level. And if it does those things, then why can't it be Star Trek? I think we do ourselves more of a disservice by trying to adhere to a canon which didn't exist until 1987, when Gene realized that, oh, I could create a universe, and wasn't even really trying to create a universe. So yeah, people can come at me for that. That's fine. If they want to, hammer me for hating canon, they're more than welcome to. But I think canon does a disservice to all of Star Trek.
No one's going to come at you, Bill. You're a teddy bear, man. Everyone loves you.
That remains to be seen. That's certainly from my podcast partner.
But I just have to add that, I think that, I think that you're right in that canon for Star Trek is a very problematic concept. But, you got to take the show on its own terms, right? They made episodic television in an episodic way with some themes and some story elements from time to time that carried over. But it certainly wasn't meant to be this, continuous, internally consistent story. And you compare that against another show, which I know you haven't watched because we talked about it, but Babylon 5, which was an incredible show. But that show promised right up front that we are telling a single consistent story over 5 seasons, and we're setting things up in season 1 that you're not going to see again for 4 years, and it's by design. And we have the universe laid out. We know what the rules are. And if something doesn't make sense, it's because we made a mistake and we apologize for it, and that was how they set it up and ran the show.
Well, if we're going to adhere to a canon, then, we have to go all the way back and deal with some of the first introduced facts, and that the captain of the Starship Enterprise is Captain James R. Kirk of the United Earth Space Probe Agency, and his first officer, the Vulcanian Mr. Spock. Those facts alone demonstrate to me why there should be a canon. Yeah, who smiles at flowers. Those facts alone demonstrate to me why canon is a farce.
Okay, well then let me ask you about the drumhead, because we'd mentioned 2 TNG episodes. We talked about family. And by the way, one thing I just have to say about family before we leave it alone. I just love in that episode how doting of a husband Robert is with, I think it's Marie. Yes. I just love that he's a jerk to his brother, but he's so sweet with her. And it's just one of my favorite parts of the whole episode. And it's not even really essential to the episode in any way, but I just loved it so much.
No, I agree with you there. And, we can draw from that, too, that he's probably a halfway decent dad, right? Because Renee seems to be a pretty average and normal kid, which is pretty awesome for Star Trek.
Absolutely. And, one of the things I just want to make a note that I want to come back to this episode later because there's another episode that I'm going to want to talk about with you where I think how you interpret the episode changes significantly based on who you are and the stage in life that you are. So I just want to make a note of that because we're going to come back and talk about this some more. So sure. Let's move on to the drumhead. Certainly a fan favorite in a lot of ways, and certainly an episode that makes a lot of top 10 lists. And of course, it has one of my favorite Star Trek tropes, a Badmiral. We love the Badmirals. So tell me why the drumhead is certainly an episode that's meaningful for you, Bill.
Well, I love it so much because it's the Crucible in space, right? I mean, it's a conspiracy theory where there's no conspiracy. It shows how horribly things can go, even in an organization like Starfleet, which is supposed to be above all of these things. And the one sole voice of reason is our intrepid captain. It's about a process that goes horribly wrong because of the obsession of one person, and how even some characters we know can buy in and realize they were pretty stupid to do so toward the end. And Worf, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, he was totally into that. He's like, witch hunt, I'm on board, man. Sign me up for this.
Yeah. And, it really is a witch hunt. This is the Salem witch trials for Star Trek for all intents and purposes. And all Picard is trying to do is to rationally get to the bottom of this, whereas Admiral Satie she's going all Sherman through Georgia on this thing. I mean, she's going to burn down whatever she can and whomever she can in the process. So it's all about, it's all about truth, and I think that's a concept that I enjoy. It's not necessarily about scientific truth. It's all about being true to ourselves and not letting processes and witch hunts get the best of us, because I think that it draws a great allegory to any time in American history, right? Whether it's Watergate, or whether it's Iran Contra, or whether it's, I don't know, pick the investigation du jour. It says that cooler heads have to prevail, in order to find truth. And I think that's it's an episode that stands out for me for those reasons, because we rarely see these types of political conspiracies in Star Trek.
One of the characters that really stood out to me in the episode was Simon Tarsus. And I feel like his name is a biblical reference. Having some knowledge of Christian theology and early Christian history, I feel like they were making some kind of reference there, but I haven't quite been able to figure out exactly how they want that to work. So if any fans out there have a theory on that, please hit me up, feedback@trekprofiles.com, or you find me on the Twitter or Facebook and let me know your thoughts. But the one thing I want to point out is that there was actually something there, in that this guy did falsify his application into Starfleet.
He did. And it was probably for the most, uneventful of reasons. I mean, I see why he left it off, because really all he wanted to do was join Starfleet, and it wasn't because of anything nefarious. So yeah, there was the tiniest of theirs there, but they kind of stumbled upon it in the course of looking for something much more grand. And I think it shows how at times the justice system can pervert even the most innocent of intents, even if it's something that wasn't necessarily the way it was supposed to be done.
This, again, is one of these episodes that, in my viewing of it, of course, and for every viewer, it's always informed by your own experiences in life. And as a veteran, I'll never forget this moment when I was in boot camp. And of course, when you're joining the military, there's all this paperwork involved, and you finally get shipped off to boot camp at some point. And they had this meeting that they used to call MOT. And I never knew what that stood for, because they were like, MOT's coming up next week. You better be ready. Okay, MOT. I was like, what is this? And they would take you into a room with a guy, and he was the guy who was in charge of your clearance. And he would sit down and he would say, this is your MOT, your moment of truth. This is your very last chance to tell us anything that is not in your paperwork, or to recant anything. If you come out of this meeting and we discover something, you will be prosecuted. You will be put in the brig. We can do whatever we want, but you can tell me anything you want right now. No penalty. Worst thing that'll happen is that we send you home.
Wow.
And I was like, and I'm thinking like, oh, did I get a parking ticket and not put it down? So as I was
pressure.
Yeah, it really is a moment of pressure. And I guess that's why, for me, that moment sticks out, because I will never forget that meeting with that guy in the room. And that was something everybody did. It wasn't just me. It was a routine part of the thing. But I just remembered it. And so it always affects my perception of the episode as I watch it.
And I think that's key, right? It gives you a perspective that I'm sure so few other people have. Watching it, for me, I mean, the theater I've been exposed to in my life, I immediately thought of The Crucible and Arthur Miller, and the Salem witch trials, and that was how it resonated for me. But it's interesting that an episode can have such two different memories inspired from the same content. That always fascinates me.
And by the way, that's another reference or linkage in the episode to Christian history, right? Because that was really a mania of some very religious people that was happening during the witch trials. And so I'm not sure what the subtext is there with that and the Simon of Tarsus name, but I thought it was just very interesting.
I agree.
Okay, so we've got the drumhead, and one of the main elements in that episode, it seems to me, is the relationship between Admiral Satie and her past father, who apparently was this legal giant of great reputation. And I wonder if some of her zeal in the episode is related to her feeling that she's not as adequate or of the stature that her father was, and she's desperately trying to get there in some way and breaking all the glasses in an attempt to do so.
I think that's possible. I think it's equally as possible that, her father, like you said, was considered a legal giant, and she's looking for, a moment where she sort of breaks, not necessarily breaks out on her own, but at least is the equivalent of him, and on her own terms, because she's probably been compared to him her whole life. And, or maybe she's just bat guano crazy, and there's that aspect too.
Well, the reason I bring it up, Bill, and hopefully people, when they listen to this, can maybe figure it out at the end. I think it'll be clear. But as I look at the episodes that you've picked, I think that overall they have a very strong dynamic of family relations that runs through all of them, with the exception maybe of the Corbomite maneuver. But this is something that I think we should touch on as we go through each of the rest of these.
I think that makes sense. And I'll admit that the drumhead is a very unintentional pick in that regard, or perhaps a very subconscious one.
All right, well, then let's move on to the next one, which is The Visitor, Deep Space Nine. So this is the episode, of course, where we have grown-up Jake, and he is suffering these repeated visits by the ghost of his father through some technobabble construct, and he's desperately trying to restore the right order of things. So tell me why this episode was meaningful for you.
This is the only episode of Star Trek that makes me weep every time I see it. And I don't mean just cry a little, but I mean openly, cry, because I think it's beautiful from start to finish. For me, this is my all-time favorite Star Trek episode, hands down. I think it is, without question, Star Trek's finest hour. And in making that statement, I am considering it against The City on the Edge of Forever, The Inner Light, any of what most people consider to be Star Trek's greatest episode. Because at the core of this episode is the love between a father and son. Jake has to deal with the loss of his father, and he spends a lifetime dealing with it until he realizes that the only way to set things right is to end his own life. And although he has no memory of it, at the end you realize that Benjamin remembers everything. And every time he looks at his son after that, he's going to have to consider the fact that his son gave up everything in order to bring him back because he needed his father. And I think it tells a story that is much more believable than The City on the Edge of Forever, at least as far as relationships go. And I think it is so masterfully and wonderfully done that it's hard not to feel affected by it just talking about it now. I was fortunate enough to have a brief conversation with Tony Todd in Springfield, Massachusetts last summer. And I brought up this episode, and he immediately started to get tears in his eyes because this episode means something to him as far as his family goes. He started to tell us a story about his sister, and he had to stop at that point because he couldn't go on anymore. So it occurred to me at that point that this is an episode that gives people the same reaction that it gave to me. And that was a kind of a wake-up call for me that it's not just me, if that makes sense. So for me, for time and all eternity, this is Star Trek's finest hour, and it stands head and shoulders above even City on the Edge.
Well, I want to put some questions to you, Bill, but I feel like I have to do a little bit of throat clearing before I do, in that I'm going to put some questions to you, and it's not an effort to raise the temperature or to be provocative, but
sure.
I want to ask some hard questions because I really want to get to the meaning of the episode for you. And so I say these not to criticize, but to give you some provocations to respond to.
Certainly.
So if people want to come at me for that, they certainly can. And I will respond with love and generosity. Don't you feel that the episode is limited in a way in that because Jake doesn't remember it, it affects the power of the whole thing? Just like when we talked about City on the Edge of Forever, Kirk has no reflection of it after. He's not brooding on it. It's right back to normal Kirk life. And you think, well, that lessens the impact of City. Doesn't it lessen the impact of this episode that Jake has no recollection of it in any way?
I don't, because Benjamin is the one who carries the reflection forward. No parent wants to see their child, go through something like that. And now Benjamin Sisko has to live with the fact that, his son went through a lifetime of pain and torment and ultimately decided to end his own life just for his father. He made that sacrifice for him when, I'm sure that, Benjamin would have, wanted it to be the other way around 100 times out of 100. I think that it changes the tone of the episode and probably makes it a little more impactful because Cisco has to live with this now every time he looks at his son. And I think that probably carries more weight than if Jake remembered.
I think if Jake were a parent is he a parent in this episode? Does he have kids?
No.
If Jake were, that's what I thought. That was my recollection. If Jake had kids, I think that having a kid for the right reasons can be one of the most selfless acts a person can do.
Sure.
And it's about paying it forward, right? So parents do a lot of things for their kids, and you don't do it because you expect a return on investment, right? It's not a financial calculation. And so to me, as a parent, when I watch the episode, I think that Jake, in a lot of ways, is inflicting a tremendous torture upon his father by making the decision he did, because that's not how this works. As the son, or as the offspring, or as the child, you are not to sacrifice for your parent. They're supposed to sacrifice for you. And by turning it around in that way, which was lovely and for good intentions, I think that it is probably the worst kind of torture he could have done to his father to do that.
And ultimately, I think that's what makes it more impactful for that exact reason. Here is Benjamin Sisko, who, by all accounts, is the emissary of the prophets and the guy who's supposed to bring Bajor into the Federation, the guy who's supposed to avoid a Dominion war. And, he wears his love for his son on his sleeve. And now he has to deal with this. It adds a layer to that dynamic that he probably never thought possible, and certainly we've never seen in Star Trek. So I think it creates probably for greater impact in that sense, because you're right, it's not the way it's supposed to happen, and now Benjamin has to live with that.
Man, it's certainly a pretty powerful episode, and it has a lot to consider in it. Let's go to Enterprise for a minute, unless there's something else you want to say about the Visitor.
No, I think if that could be an entire 2-hour conversation on its own, the Visitor, because I think it's that good. So no, I'm happy to press on.
Okay. So, because the reason I want to press on is because I think that there's an interesting element here. And again, it's that thread that I think I've identified, is that there's this strong family issue in a lot of the episodes that have come up in this discussion. So for Enterprise, you pick Twilight, which is the episode where Archer sort of lives out his future, similar to the Visitor in some ways. And he's now with T'Pol, and they're in this sort of relationship, and they have this own relationship dynamic. And then there's an effort to set everything right again. So it has some of the same sort of themes in the Visitor, and it's an interesting contrast. So it seems like what's old is new again in this particular episode. So why'd you pick it?
I picked it for what Archer goes through. This sort of long-term, short-term memory loss, for want of a better way to describe it, that he goes through, because it affects and informs his entire day. You figure he's every day of his life since that accident, he's had T'Pol tell him this story, and maybe sometimes it was longer, maybe sometimes it was shorter, but he's had to come to this realization and this place where he probably resents or feels anger about the whole situation, or then perhaps maybe even a little bit of shame, or perhaps maybe even a little bit of uncertainty every single day of his life. And he doesn't remember it from the day before. And I thought that it was an interesting thing to put a starship captain through. Now, granted, there's a reset button at the end of this, much like there is at the end of The Visitor. But I think that this perhaps is one of the best reset button episodes of all time, because it's all about the personal interaction, and not necessarily like, say, Voyager's Year of Hell, which is necessarily about resetting the ship from being destroyed again. So that's kind of where I was going with that one. It's just, I think it's an eminently watchable hour of Enterprise. And I love the interaction between T'Pol and Archer.
I do too. And of course, though, my favorite little moment has to be the fact that Archer stabs the Xindi with a Zephram Cochrane statue.
Yes. I think that's fantastic.
Just one of these little details that just blew my mind when I was watching the episode. And I said, oh my God, that's a Zephram Cochrane statue. Just amazing.
I thought it was just a wonderful moment, and a little beautiful Easter egg for any Star Trek fan.
Oh, absolutely. But one of the things you mentioned in your discussion of the episode there is something that I think is very powerful, which is that, as fans talking about these episodes, Bill, we're talking about episodes where it's mostly people just standing around talking. It's not about those sci-fi tropes that we always hear about, the big ships and the laser gun battles and pew 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 and crazy aliens, and there is that stuff, but in the really great episodes, they're incidental to the story, not the purpose of the story. But as Star Trek fans are stereotyped, it seems to be that that's the stuff that we care about, and it's not at all, which is one of the things I fight against, and I imagine you do too.
Without question, these stories that I've picked are all great examinations of the human condition. I mean, that's what Star Trek has always been. Usually it does it through the conceit of science fiction action, but in this case, it really just puts it all out there in wordiness. And I think that's one of the reasons why I love these episodes so much.
Anybody who talks to me about Trek for any period of time will discover that one of my favorite episodes is Let That Be Your Last Battlefield from TOS season 3. And I always like to refer to that episode as an example of this, because it's an example of when you can use science fiction to tell stories that you couldn't tell in the real world in a contemporary setting, because people would just get wrapped around the axle immediately about the kind of issues that they were bringing up if it was set on the real Earth at the time.
I agree with you 100%. It's one of those episodes that, I think that is underappreciated simply because there's a little bit of ham-handedness there with that episode, a little bonk bonk on the head, if you will. There are some parts of it that, as you and I have laughed about, sort of Frank Gorshin's, running through the halls of the Enterprise looking
and
like
running.
and running like a rubber doll with his arms flailing everywhere. It's fun to have a laugh at, but the serious message, the undertone of the episode is so much more gravity laden than that.
When we were putting these episodes together, one of them came up that I have to admit really surprised me, because you picked an episode that is not actually an episode of Star Trek. You picked a fan film. Star Trek Continues, Come Not Between the Dragons. So let's talk a little bit about Star Trek Continues, and then maybe we'll talk about the episode. How did Star Trek Continues come to your attention?
I think, like most people, I saw somebody mention it on Facebook once. And then I gave it a shot because I've seen, many of the fan films, certainly before I was ever a podcaster. And then I took a look at this one and I'm like, all right, well, let's see what this one's about. And I pretty much figured that I was going to think it was as dreadful as some others. And then I watched it, their very first episode, Pilgrim of Eternity. And I was stunned at how wonderfully constructed it was and how it was not, mimicry. It was people assuming these roles that weren't trying to act like William Shatner or Leonard Nimoy. They were trying to portray Kirk and Spock. And then I got the sense that the stories were really Star Trek stories. They weren't kludged together. They didn't rely necessarily on a lot of tropes, but they tried to tell original stories that, made the viewer think that this was just a continuation of the original series. And at that point, I bought in. I started to watch their other episodes, and over the years, I developed a wonderful friendship with Vic Mignogna, the creator and the producer and the star of Star Trek Continues. He's become a dear friend, and I have to thank him on some level for rekindling my love of the original series. I mean, I've always loved TOS, but watching Star Trek Continues made me realize why I loved the original series so much. And, it made me remember that I'm at my core an original series guy from back in the day. So I got to go to set actually during the making of this particular episode and watch it being filmed, or at least some portions of it. And then, but at that point I had no idea what the script of the episode truly involved. And then I have to say, this is the only episode of Star Trek Continues I've only ever seen once.
Well, you're going to have to say more about that, Bill.
See, I knew you'd say that. This episode is about, abuse and child abuse in particular. And, I've certainly not made it a secret, and I've talked about it a few times on Trek Geeks, including our 100th episode, that, for years I endured a level of mental abuse from my father that involved, constant beration. My father, when he was alive, was in the years before me, he was a Marine Corps gunnery sergeant, and he spent time at Camp Lejeune, and he was one of those stereotypical, Marine Corps sergeants who yelled and screamed at people. And I endured a good decade or more of, when he and I were alone, just never physical abuse, but certainly mental. And, I was called just about every name in the book, and I was dragged into, our bathroom and stood on the scale and screamed at for hours and minimalized and marginalized and, had, my very character questioned as a child. I would never repeat most of the names he called me on a podcast because I wouldn't want to ruin anyone's podcast rating, but it was at its core, and it took me years to be okay with calling it this. It was absolutely abuse. And I have a hard time watching Come Not Between the Dragons as much as I loved and appreciated the episode, because it hits a little too close to home for me, because it's about the abuse between a parent and child at the end of the day. And it's something that I found difficult to watch as much as I enjoyed it.
Well, at least it has the advantage of the father character coming around in the end.
To some extent. I mean, at least that's what we're led to believe, right? So it's crafted very well. It's an episode that has great performances by Gigi Edgley from Farscape. She's fantastic in the episode. And plus the, for want of a better word, the creature, Usti, in the episode is really just a magnificent creation as a practical costumed character. It's just, it's amazing to see on the screen how well it works.
Well, certainly everything associated with Star Trek Continues as a technical achievement is just amazing. It really is just, and I marveled at it, to be perfectly honest. In fact, I'll even say for myself, it was almost an impediment to enjoying the episode. And that's my own hang up. It's not a criticism, but I just kept looking at it saying, this looks so much like the 60s show in so many ways. There were some notable exceptions to this, but, and I say that not to criticize, but merely out of admiration for what they pulled off. It was just something that, in watching any of the episodes, I just kept thinking, look at that camera angle, or look at the way they stage this. And, even the production values, and just the makeup and the hair, and just so many of these things that are outside of the story kept pulling me out of it, because I just marveled at it. Truly. I mean, it was clear that these guys and ladies clearly were putting their hearts and souls into it.
And they did, and it was evident to see while I was there, on set. That whole, pre-credits, prologue on the bridge where the creature is going through the hall, and they're, tracking it, and I was actually there, just standing to the right of Spock's science station on set when they were filming those scenes. And at that point, I had no idea the gravity of the episode, because I hadn't seen the full script, but like I said, I've watched all of the other episodes multiple times except this one, because of how close to home it hits. And that perhaps is the common thread that goes through my picks. There's the strained and somewhat painful relationship I had with my father growing up, and all of the trauma that it brought to my life. I still deal with situational anxiety as a result, which, takes many forms, but it's all a result of many of those experiences that I had growing up. And it's, my selections for episodes do all include family, but also include very targeted relationships.
As I watch the episode, I don't know where they fall chronologically in with the TOS episodes themselves. I know it's supposed to be a continuation, but as I watched it, I was wondering if perhaps Spock was more affected by it because he also has some pretty significant daddy issues.
Oh, yeah, he does. Well, I think that's part of the projection of the character. Perhaps Spock was the most affected by it because of those, or perhaps because he's half Vulcan. It's hard to say. But certainly it introduced an element that was very interesting, especially when Spock was first affected by that red wave. So if folks haven't seen the Star Trek Continues episodes, I can't recommend them highly enough. They are the work and the creation of so many wonderful people who've become friends of mine over the years. And this episode for me is just, it's beautiful and difficult all at the same time.
I understand. Thank you for sharing that, Bill. It's certainly something no one should have to deal with. So I appreciate you for your honesty and sharing it. And if there's ever anything anyone can do to help you, let the fan community know, and we'll be there for you, my brother.
Well, thank you. That's awfully kind of you to say. And luckily, I mean, the fan community is always there for me. Each and every week we do Trek Geeks, so it's the best outlet there is.
I totally agree with you. Podcasting's a bug, man. And talking about Trek with awesome people is just the highlight of my month when I get to do this with wonderful people such as yourself. So now I have to ask you about a couple of other episodes that the M5 has selected for us, one of which is Errand of Mercy, a TOS classic, I would say, and also the introduction of the Klingons into the Star Trek universe. So tell me about this episode and why it was meaningful to you.
Well, and that's exactly it, right? It perhaps provides Captain Kirk's, greatest foil. I still think Kor is the Klingon by which all other Klingons should be, compared and measured. It's just it's such a wonderful script that you think is going to take us to the brink of war until the Organians say, not so fast. It forces them to find a way to tolerate one another that doesn't have to end in violence. And I think that that's probably even greater than the introduction of the Klingons for me. I find it to be a fantastic episode. John Colicos just sort of chews the scenery and creates something really special. And it's one of the few times where Shatner doesn't seem as Shatnerian to create an adjective.
Yeah, he's only at like 25% Shatner power.
Yeah, he doesn't get to go full Shat.
Well, it's interesting because we were talking earlier about the idea that science fiction allows us to do these sort of modern scenes, regular human scenes through this lens of science fiction. And the bit at the end where Eilborn is talking to the two of them and imposing the Organian peace treaty, the lines that Kor and Kirk are saying are like two siblings who got caught, fighting over a football. And the parent is there saying, no, you be quiet, right? It is literally that scene, right? You two need to kiss and make up and go to your separate corners and play separately. It is that exact scene just told in a sci-fi setting.
You're 100% right. I never thought about it in those terms before, but it made me think of many a car ride with my younger sister where we had to draw a line down the back seat of my mom's 1972 Plymouth Duster. And one of us crossed the line, it meant a flying backhand.
Oh, goodness.
Oh, yeah.
But, you talk about, I was mentioning earlier, being brought out of the episode by things that just occur in my own head. And this episode always, as much as I love it too, I always get pulled out of the episode unintentionally because this is where Spock says pure energy, which then found its way into that Information Society song from the 80s, which being a kid of the 80s was always something that was in my head.
Absolutely. I remember hearing that for the first time as a kid in the 80s and go, oh my God, that's Spock.
Yeah.
It's the only listenable part of the song if you think about it. But, and then there was the band T'Pau, which did Heart and Soul.
Yeah. Well, it was a woman. It wasn't a band. I think it was her.
Well, she and her husband. So I think he was the musician and she was the singer.
Oh, gotcha.
Sort of like a synth age Captain and Tennille, if you will.
Oh, my goodness gracious. Another episode that the M5 selected was The Offspring. So certainly a classic TNG episode, very powerful. Tell me why this one made your list.
I have to say, this is the first episode of Star Trek that really made me cry. It was the first one where I felt invested all the way through. That scene at the end where the Admiral comes out of the lab and says, his hands were moving faster than I could see. At that point, it goes from a little bit of tears to just waterworks because that there's no coming back. It's an episode that is just beautifully crafted. Jonathan Frakes directs the hell out of this episode. And from start to finish, it is just an amazing character story. Yeah, it has some sci-fi elements, but at the end of the day, this is a family episode, and it's one that speaks to me.
It's not one that's about, again, laser ships and bombs and photon torpedoes and all that. It's people talking, and it's a story about people, a family, and someone having a problem with their child, not a problem relationship, but a problem with their child's health.
And Data's lack of being able to express emotion makes it that much more significant for the viewer, because you're feeling these things for Data because he can't. And, I think that changes the tone of the episode entirely.
And earlier in our recording, we were talking about how there's this how when we watch Star Trek, it affects us by what we bring to it. And in my own viewing of this episode, I have to say that I remember when it originally came on the air and I watched it and I liked it and I thought it was great, and I was probably in high school or college or something at the time. And, it was okay. But when I came back to it many years later, I was already a parent at that point by the time I had rewatched it, and it wrecked me. And it just had a completely different effect on me because of where I was in my life. And I think that shows the nature of Star Trek being evergreen, is that you can come back to it. And because these stories are so powerful and timeless, that what we bring to the experience changes over time and we can rediscover it again, which is really interesting.
That's fascinating to me because as some people know, and many may not, I am not a parent. And I'm not a parent by choice. I never really felt like I wanted to have children, even as young as, my 20s, when there's that, that expectation from family and society that, you're going to grow up and get married and start having babies. No, that was never a journey that I felt that I needed for my humanity to feel like I'd accomplished something on this planet during my time. So I'm fascinated when I hear, perspective like that, because it changes how I think about the episode going forward.
Sure. And I think, but it's also true for a lot of other things too. It's not just parent-child relationships, right? It's like being married changes how you view relationships when you come back to some of these episodes, and I think that's just a part of the experience. But there is something we've been talking about, and I want to put a question to you. And again, I want to say, I'm not trying to criticize or raise the temperature or be provocative for provocation's sake, but I really want to get to some truths here. When you think about Discovery, right, and you're doing a weekly analysis show of Discovery, right, which is highly recommended, and our tens of listeners should certainly subscribe to it if they're not already. But do you think that because Discovery is attempting to tell a single story told over a season, that some of these episodes will not have the impact that some of these other earlier Trek Incarnation episodes have, because the anthology format allowed them to tell these single powerful stories in a short period of time with a message and sort of in a compact unit. And that structure allowed a storytelling which we're missing in Discovery.
Possibly, but I approach it from the angles that we may not be missing it. It may just be a much slower burn. Obviously with the Sarek Michael Burnham dynamic there, already it's taken several significant pivots for them, even in just season one. And I'm fascinated to learn more about that interaction and where eventually it goes awry, because it kind of has to, right? The more so than it kind of did in season one. For those who haven't seen it, I don't want to say too much, but I figure that there's more time to explore some of these things in depth because they are taking a different approach to the storytelling. So we may not get it in the span of 43, 45, 50 minutes, but we may get it over the course of X number of seasons, because I kind of look at this as a novel for television that's being unfolded one chapter at a time.
I gotcha. And, it's interesting because we talked earlier about the idea that we have these major things happening in TOS episodes or TNG episodes, and we don't necessarily see the impact of that ever again, right? Like Jeremy Astor or even Lal in The Offspring, right? Whatever became of that, right? Well, we don't know. And so in Discovery, I wonder if perhaps the needle is now in the completely other direction, where everything comes back, and because everything is so spread out, we don't really get the impact of a single episode, and you almost have to binge it to get the story. It seems like a fool's game to try to watch each episode and analyze it in some way.
To some extent, there's certainly things you can take from one week to the next, but I have a feeling that there are some character aspects and elements, and maybe even relationships that may not be apparent until well after the series is done, and we look at it in hindsight that way. Because we will have the benefit of hindsight then, and perhaps we're just too close to it now.
Let's see if we can sort of wrap this up in a profound way. And we've talked a little bit about this, and I think you've mentioned some ways that Star Trek is meaningful to you. But what I really want to understand for you is, what is your definition of Star Trek? So many fans are quick to say, and I probably am guilty of this myself, that's not Star Trek. That's not Star Trek. This isn't Star Trek. That's not Star Trek. Well, to say something like that, you have to have some idea of what Star Trek is. So I put the question to you, Bill. What is Star Trek?
I have to laugh because as I get older, that question gets tougher and tougher to answer, especially since I've decided to free myself of canon. I have to say it's tough because I'm of two separate minds on this topic, and they conflict with each other very markedly. We give this show sort of an elevated place in pop culture because it's become part of the daily fabric of our lives. And I think it deserves that on some level. But I think we have to keep the perspective that this is a TV show. And I think we lose that perspective at times, but that said, it's more important than that. And it's in direct, contradiction to the previous 30 seconds that I just spoke about. Because for me personally, given my history of mental abuse as a child, it's a lifeboat and a safe place. I endured those years of abuse and bullying, and the Starship Enterprise was my safe place. It was where I went to in my mind during those moments, and it kept me as sane as it could. It was a complete dissociation of sorts, and I talk about this in our 100th episode to some extent. But that Enterprise holds a special place in my heart because I've walked those corridors so many times, and I've been on that bridge in my mind every single day as a child because I had to be there. And I think that's probably why I cried when the Enterprise was destroyed in Star Trek 3, because that was, that was my place. That was my ship of dreams and my safe harbor. And, it's a TV show, but for me, it was what got me through a childhood that, most kids should never have to go through.
This is an interesting provocation you bring up because it is true that it's just a TV show. But I think one of the conceits of this podcast is that, yes, the show is the show, but people are taking that show and making it real in their lives in a very profound way. In some cases, some people just watch the show and they watch it and that's it. But there's people like you, me, and many of the other people I've talked to, and many of the people you've talked to, and you certainly talked to more than me, are doing things with Star Trek in their life that make it much more expressive and or beyond just a TV show. I mean, I don't think that there are conventions of Cheers fans.
Probably not.
And I don't think that there are people that are that there's a number of podcasts and fan films of ER, as great a show as that was. And so for a guy like yourself, you're committing a significant amount of your personal time and your quatloos and, many other things to going to conventions. And let's just stick with podcasting for a second, for being a guest on this show, for doing multiple podcasts. So Star Trek is a big part of your life because you're devoting a lot of time and energy to it. So it can't just be a TV show, Bill.
Well, I think I do that to keep myself grounded. I have to remind myself of the day that, that it is a TV show. Yes, it has this significant meaning for me, but I think it's how I maintain my sense of humility about it all. Because to me, that's important. It would be really easy to do nothing but podcasts and watch nothing but Star Trek 24/7. But I tell myself that to remind myself that there are things which are, equally, if not more important in my life that mean just as much to me, if not more. And I don't say that to demean anybody else's love of Star Trek. That's certainly not my intent. But, it's my way of keeping myself grounded and in the world, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. And I think but that's where Star Trek comes alive, right? I mean, the show would not be where it is today as part of pop culture or in people's lives if there hadn't been people, say, I think especially in the 70s, who kept it going and who breathed life into the franchise, totally separate from what Paramount at the time was doing. And I think all of us, you, me, and all the other people that are in this incredible fandom community are still breathing life to it, bringing life to it in new and interesting ways. It really is something I haven't quite wrapped my brain around yet, and it's still a little bit of a mystery to me. And I'm part of it. I'm in it, and it's still a mystery to me.
Well, and I get that, I seem like I'm contradicting myself significantly. I mean, I have 2 podcasts, for crying out loud. There's not a day that I go through where Star Trek isn't involved, whether in my mode of dress or my entertainment choice, or even in the commission of trying to produce a podcast. Trek is always there. I mean, I have 4 Star Trek tattoos on my body. I've got one on my wrist that says "Boldly Go," which is to remind me that I can make it through my anxiety. It's my guidepost and also my trophy on some level to help celebrate the things I've done. I mean, I've got the Trek Geeks Delta right underneath that on my forearm because my podcast has become an extension of my fandom. And then I discovered that other people access their fandom through my podcast, which is pretty amazing if you think about that. Your spoken words go out into the ether and it means something to somebody else. And then I've got a classic Starfleet Delta on my left shoulder. And then I've got a Star Trek style original, and by Star Trek, I mean the original series, pinup tattoo on my right arm, because Star Trek is part of who I am. It's in my DNA. So, I have to keep reminding myself that it's a TV show, because I can imagine myself becoming even more immersive and obsessive about it. And I have to try to keep myself grounded, or else my wife is probably going to look to to get me committed.
Well, yeah, there's a danger of becoming that guy from the Black Mirror episode, right?
Yes, absolutely. Right.
Well, we certainly don't want that. So, on that note of caution, I have to tell you, Bill, that the M5 is now signaling me that it is time to face the Kobayashi Maru.
Oh, I can't wait for this. The M5 is devious in its crafting of these choices. I'm sure they're all going to be impossible, and I welcome the challenge.
All right. M5, load the Kobayashi Maru simulation and prepare to record Bill's responses.
Working. Simulation loaded and ready for use.
Question 1. Time to unwind in the evening with a libation. Romulan ale and Klingon blood wine are both on offer. What's your choice?
I'm going to go Klingon blood wine.
Would you rather play a round of poker on the Enterprise D with our TNG friends, or some baseball with our usual lineup of DS9ers?
Poker on the Enterprise D.
Which is the better episode, And the Children Shall Lead or Spock's Brain?
Spock's Brain, by a landslide.
Time to choose your pain, Bill. Would you rather take your chances as a red shirt on a TOS landing party, or be a Starfleet officer at the Battle of Wolf 359?
I would be a red shirt every day and twice on Sunday.
Which of these would make it more awkward for you as an officer in Starfleet? 1. Being turned into a giant transwarp slug that's going to end up having space slug babies with the captain? Or B. Being forced to rub Star Trek Enterprise decontamination gel all over your coworker's back knee every time y'all come back from the planet?
Oh man, this is particularly devious, M5. I am going to go with space slug.
Awesome. Simulation complete. M5, please compute the results and tell us if Bill has passed the Kobayashi Maru.
Results analyzed and loaded.
Bill Smith, I am pleased to tell you that the M5 has calculated that you have passed the Kobayashi Maru simulation with flying colors. Congratulations.
I was sweating it there. Those questions were fantastic. Kudos all around to the M5. I loved every one of those choices.
And now the M5, who has analyzed your answers, will award you an honorary Star Trek title on behalf of the Trek Profiles podcast. M5, what title shall we award our guest?
William Smith is awarded the title of Tribble Ranch King of the Alpha Quadrant.
I've always wanted to be a Tribble Ranch King. Does that come with a crown? That's all I want to know.
It comes with a fuzzy Tribble crown.
I will take it, and I will rule with great benevolence.
We, as your loyal and adoring subjects, look forward to seeing the pictures of your coronation. Bill, please tell people how they can get in touch with you.
Absolutely. On Twitter, you can find me at TrekGeekBill. Pretty easy to remember. I'm also the same on Instagram. On the Facebooks, probably facebook.com/TrekGeeks or facebook.com/Discovering Trek. That's our other Discovery-focused podcast. Or if you want to join our wonderful Facebook group, Camp Kittimer, there's all kinds of Star Trek fans there. It's a very positive and open place where we try to keep the trolling to a minimum and just have great Star Trek discussion.
Unsolicited endorsement for Camp Kittimer. It's a really great Facebook group and very positive. So I know what's involved in moderating those groups and keeping them a good place. So good on you for doing that.
We have fantastic friends who help us admin. Obviously, Heather from Tricorder Transmissions Network on Shore Leave and Disco Trek, probably one of the most wonderful human beings on the planet. In addition to our friends Jackie and Dan Garcia, who also help Dan and me admin the site. They do a fabulous job, and they are such fantastic friends of ours.
Thanks for being a part of the Trek Profiles podcast, Bill.
Thank you for having me, my friend, and thanks to everyone that chooses to listen to my pedantic babbling in this episode.
Here ends this installment of the Trek Profiles podcast. And before we offer a Trek quote to close this episode, I'd like to remind you that you may send us your helpful comments, nasty grams, your hearty congratulations, or your recipes for a nice beef brisket. I'm getting a new grill and I'm trying to think of things to make with it, to feedback@trekprofiles.com, or you can comment on Facebook or Twitter at Trek Profiles. Anything you send us may be used in the show or might be sucked into a temporal vortex. This week, I leave you with a quote from Captain Sisko, who in the episode The Visitor said to his son Jake, quote, "I'm no writer, but if I were, it seems to me I'd want to poke my head up every once in a while, take a look around and see what's going on. It's life, Jake. You can miss it if you don't open your eyes." Close quote. Thanks for listening and live long and prosper.